Now, what happened like in the past 4 years, and that's a change that really started recently and that starts to bloom and getting full-blown right now. This architecture change in the 2010s is based on two changes. The first one is on the devices side, where there are lots of different devices, mobile phones, operating systems that are as powerful as desktop used to be. And then there's HTML5. If you look at the HTML5 specification, you have 2D vector graphics, even 3D, local storage, multiple threads. You have essentially the same kind of capabilities that you had in desktops 20 years ago. So to me, that new world of devices and services, it requires a new architecture and a new that will remind you some of the old. I think we're back to client-server. And then on the server side, what changed from 20 years ago is that 20 years ago you needed to have like a few vertically scalable big machines to handle your application. Now we're going to a horizontal scalability model with cloud architectures. So there's been lots of talks about cloud computing. To me, what cloud computing is, it's just a productization of distributed infrastructure that large consumer companies like Microsoft or Google built for their internal properties that they're starting to expose to third parties. So the data sets, the size of data became huge, the storage capacity is growing faster than bandwidth, there's fast networks. We went from a vertical scalability model to a horizontal model, which makes lots of changes. And then virtualization, especially in the data center, really helped move these old applications onto new machines that are more powerful and consolidate all that. Now, when you talk to analysts nowadays, they will go with the classic pyramid of software as a service at the top, which is things like Office 365, where you access applications in your browser. On demand, it's hosted somewhere else. Platform as a service below it. So platform as a service is a higher level than infrastructure. It's really a set of services, like Azure for websites is a good example of that. And then infrastructure as a service is the equivalent of hardware in that new world. In terms of numbers of these platforms and infrastructure, the pyramid is completely reversed. So I like you to look at it this way, where there will be very few infrastructure providers, and Microsoft with Hyper-V is really one of the top there. Then on top of that, you have several platform as a services, and there's a whole industry there's a whole industry around platform as a service. A big battle right now with lots of players like Cloud Foundry, there's Google App Engine, there's Azure websites, and some of them will cater to specific verticals, some of them will get installed in certain countries, some of them are proprietary, others are open source. So you have lots of choices there, and I'd say this layer is the one where there's still a lot of discussion. There will be more of them. And then you have tons of software as a service. Now for developers, people who are creating applications in that new world, I think the platform as a service layer is really the most interesting one. For IT pros, they're going to manage the infrastructure as a service, and they're going to set up platforms internally and externally in that hybrid cloud mode. And as I said before, the big fight for platform as a service was like 2 years ago, where everybody was going there. But in terms of importance and penetration, I would say that this year it's really infrastructure as a service that is mostly interesting, where there's lots of action and competition. In terms of big data, so that's an interesting aspect. When I was at Google, I really had the impression that we were ahead of everybody by several years. And when you look at the papers, that's a recommendation I give you, just look at the papers that Google Research publishes, where they talk about their internal infrastructure. Usually they kind of predict the future of the market by 2 or 3 years. So in 2004, they had a paper about MapReduce for horizontal scalability for processing large amounts of data. This year, the Hadoop open source project is like super fashionable. So 2004 2004 to 2013, it took 9 years for the market to get to that. And actually, Microsoft is a big player there with Azure HD Insight. In 2006, there was a big table paper where they introduced that notion of NoSQL for having a large amount of unstructured data that you could query in an easy way. And that gave birth to all these NoSQL databases and that market that's starting to bloom with things like Mongo, Cassandra, HBase, React. In 2010, real-time analytics with Dremel, that was productized by Google as BigQuery. And in 2012, like last year, they published a new paper about a system called Spanner that is a cross-data center distributed SQL engine that allows for transaction. One of the interesting aspects of that paper is that for the first time, and I think that will be an important trend for cloud computing in the next few years, for the first time, it's not only a software innovation, so Spanner is really about distributed software that's using an algorithm called Paxos that uses vector clocks for replication of data. And the problem is that clocks are not very accurate, so what they did to make it perform at the right level of functionality is that they use atomic clocks in the various data centers to synchronize all that. The interesting trend here is that the hardware of the data center begins to be as important as the software, and there's a mix between that. So another big trend is what is called consumerization of the enterprise. So lots of applications are self-service, they're in software as a service mode, like Office 365 is a good example of that. Another trend is mobile, and bring your own device in enterprises. Your employees are coming into companies with their own devices of many different, using many different operating systems, and you need the tools to manage them. And so System Center and Intune are good ways to do that. Social is also a big trend that has started in consumer with things like Facebook and Twitter, and now is moving into the enterprise with tools like Yammer. Situational apps in the enterprise, there's an interesting aspect, a new type of apps that are developed where instead of building an app planning an app for 6 months and then building it for a year and then using it for 10 years, you're building apps, for example, for this conference, for registering for this conference that you're going to use for a few weeks, and you want to build them in a few weeks and deploy and iterate on them. So it's a different model, and that means on the development side, we're going from the waterfall model to agile methodologies. And that means also on the IT Pro side, you need to evolve and allow these agile methodologies, and we'll talk about how you can do that. So big data is a trend, and one of the things I wanted to convey here is that I think the role of the IT Pro is going to change, and the IT department, and IT that was a cost center needs to become a competitive advantage for companies. So agility as a survival skill, I talked about that. It's true both in consumer and enterprise. Cloud platforms, to me, are really an enabler of Agile. With them, the scalability is built into the platform. You don't need to build it yourself or to assemble it. At least you can control it. It allows for faster iteration when you're building and deploying apps, and you can focus on the design of the apps instead of the scalability. The other aspect is developers and IT pros can focus on driving business value as opposed to just managing infrastructure and building apps. One of the important trends, and this one is more recent than Agile. Agile is already like 10 years old. There's a new trend that's called DevOps that you may have heard about. And DevOps is a cultural movement where, and it started in consumer companies, I think it's getting in the enterprise now. It's inspired by agile methodologies, and it's a cultural movement where devs and ops start to work together. Developers and IT pros work together in order to achieve business goals faster, instead of fighting with each other, with devs just throwing some code up the wall and expecting people in ops to just make it work. There's always been a tense relationship between developers and IT pros, and I think this is starting to change. So there's a cultural change. a change in methodology, but also there are some changes in tools, and Microsoft is quite uniquely positioned to help you apply DevOps within your companies. One of the things that in the areas of tools that really change things, there's continuous delivery, the fact of considering infrastructure as code. So Damien will make some demos of things like that we have at Microsoft. And there are some more cultural things like cross-silo collaboration, small iteration, and having a constant feedback loop. So to me, the IT Pro role is changing. You guys need to learn new tools and leverage existing tool capabilities to get more agile. Considering infrastructure as code and doing as much automation as you can, learning things like PowerShell. Another aspect that's super important is hybrid cloud management. Instead of just managing a private cloud, you're managing a hybrid cloud that spans several potential providers plus your own internal IT. And DevOps is a big one, and IT has a competitive advantage for fast innovation. I wanted to finish my personal remarks about the cloud competitive landscape, how I see the landscape, and I've been at least 3 of these companies. So I'd say Google and Amazon are just focusing on the public cloud. So they tell their message to enterprises is, you want to move all your workloads in our public cloud, and if you want adaptations, we cannot provide them because it's heavily automated and we cannot give you the controls that you want. But that's the future, we have lower costs with that and all this. On the other side, you have VMware, who's very strong with virtualization in private cloud. They have something that they call the software-defined data center. That's their pitch right now. But the thing is, whether I've been at VMware or at Google, what most customers told me that what they wanted was hybrid cloud. And today, the people who are delivering the private cloud today with something we call Cloud OS is Microsoft. So with Microsoft, we'll see in the rest of the presentation, will really allow you to build your private cloud and manage a hybrid cloud with the same single pane of glass in System Center. One last thing, Google is very, so they're trying to push everything towards public cloud, and they have usually pretty strong infrastructure and data services. But the philosophy that they have, I think, is not a good match for what enterprises want. And the vision of Microsoft is around something that we call Cloud OS, where we have a consistent platform that allows you to do development, management, identity, virtualization, and managing big data in different settings. So what I mean by different settings is it can be in your own data center, it can be in a Microsoft data center like Windows Azure, or it can be in a partner, in a service provider. And one of the important aspects here is that means, depending on the type of data, the industry you are, whether it is regulated or not, you may want to have some of your data and processes and workloads within your own data centers. For others, they may be in the data center of a provider that maybe is in the same country as you are, because you are regulated, or caters to a specific vertical industry and adds some value to it with specific APIs for that industry. Or you can use the Windows Azure massive data centers that are all around the world.